Then the shutter came down. Then the shutter came down. The glitch resolved. The logic resumed. "I have a meeting," he said. He went into his meeting anyway. Mara read the announcement years later in a journal and felt the air thin. Not because she knew him, but because she recognized the cruelty. Dying before vindication means your enemies get to write the first draft of your legacy. Some people die like seeds, buried without ceremony, turning into something they will never see. A grain of wheat does not get to watch the bread rise. It only disappears into the dark and does its quiet chemistry anyway. And some people die like drops. They return to a sea that does not remember their shape. The pearl comes later. It always comes later. Usually it comes in someone else's mouth, spoken as inevitability. Of course, neural networks were always the way. Mara could hear the lie inside the "of course," the way you can hear a crack inside a glass if you tap it gently. After that, the perceptron's flaws were no longer limitations. They were moral evidence, proof that the idea itself had been a mistake, proof that anyone still pursuing it was not stubborn, but childish. Winter thickened. Mara watched the ones who stayed and felt both admiration and dread. Because she could already taste the next lesson. Survival is not the same as victory. Winter can last longer than a career. And in winter, the field learns a second, quieter lesson. History is written by whichever approach remains fundable long enough to become obvious. Chapter 7: Exile Years. Exile has a specific sound, the quiet of work done without applause. Mara met Geoffrey Hinton at a workshop that was too small to feel like a mainline conference. The coffee was bad. The room was half full. The jokes were tired. Hinton spoke anyway, with the calm intensity of someone who had decided long ago that the field's opinion was not the same as the field's truth. After the talk, Mara cornered him in the hallway beside a water fountain that tasted faintly of metal. The carpet smelled like wet wool. Someone had taped up a hand-lettered sign that said "coffee" in blocky marker, like the whole event had been assembled out of stubbornness and duct tape. "Why do you keep going?" she asked before she could polish the question into something academic. Hinton blinked, as if surprised by the honesty. He looked past her shoulder at the small crowd in the corridor, half-committed believers, half-committed skeptics, all of them tired. Then he looked back at her. "Because it's the only thing that makes sense," he said, "even when it doesn't work yet." Mara felt the phrase "doesn't work yet" lodge in her chest. Yet is a dangerous word. Yet is how people mortgage their lives. On the walk back to her hotel, she thought about the first time she had heard an advisor discourage an idea the way you discourage a child from a dangerous hobby. Not cruelly, kindly, as if kindness could make the death of a dream feel like mentorship. It had happened years earlier, when she was younger and needed permission. She remembered the office, bookshelves, the smell of old paper, a framed photograph of a famous scientist like a patron saint. She remembered her own notebook open on her lap, filled with sketches of networks, arrows, weights, general mechanisms that could, in theory, learn. Her advisor had glanced at the notebook and sighed. "You're smart," he said. "Don't waste that on this. The field has moved on." Moved on. The phrase sounded like progress. It meant exile. Mara had nodded, the way students nod when they want to survive. Then she had gone home and stared at her ceiling until she made a decision that felt less like ambition than like surrender. If the field would not give her permission, she would work without it. Afterward, someone asked a question that sounded like curiosity and was really dismissal. "If this approach works," the questioner said, "why hasn't it already won?" Hinton smiled, not unkindly. "Because," he said slowly, "it needed more computation than we had." Mara felt the sentence land like a wedge. Needed more computation than we had. It was a simple explanation that made decades of intellectual warfare look like a misunderstanding of the environment. Like two species fighting over a scarce resource, not realizing the resource would multiply. In the hallway, Mara walked beside him. "Does it ever get easier?" she asked. He looked at her for a moment. His expression held something like acceptance. "You learn to be out of sync," he said. "You learn to live without permission." Years compressed into routines, prototypes, rejections, small experiments, ignored papers. Brief thaws arrived, backpropagation, renewed interest, then faded into winter again. The routines were not dramatic. That was the cruelty. History remembers climaxes. Exile is made of Tuesdays. Mara watched Hinton's cohort publish papers that landed like stones thrown into a frozen lake, small, dark circles of disturbance that quickly disappeared under new ice. Reviewers wrote sentences that sounded reasonable and behaved like knives, not competitive with symbolic methods. Interesting, but unclear whether it scales. Too many parameters, too little understanding. A rejection letter can be polite and still feel like erasure. 1 year backpropagation arrived like a thaw that didn't become spring. People got excited, people whispered. A few doors cracked open. Then funding tightened again. Attention drifted. The field's mood changed and the thaw refroze into something harder. Now the exiles weren't just wrong, they were passé. Mara learned to measure time in the small betrayals of a community. The way colleagues stopped inviting her to certain meetings, the way her students became practical and chose safer projects, the way she began to introduce her work with an apologetic smile so other people wouldn't have to do the humiliating part for her. She told herself she was doing science. Sometimes, late at night, it felt more like contraband. Mara watched Hinton's cohort develop a survival skill that felt almost religious, the ability to treat ridicule as weather. You don't argue with weather. You dress for it. You keep walking. Some of them moved countries, not as a grand statement, but as logistics, where funding was slightly less hostile, where being out of sync was survivable. The moves were not romantic. They were bureaucratic. Forms, visas, interviews with officials who didn't care about intelligence, but cared about signatures. Mara watched Hinton do what exiles have always done: find a place where the winter is survivable, even if it is still winter. He spoke about it once in passing, like it was weather. "Some places," he said, "you can't work the way you want, so you go somewhere else." It wasn't bitterness, it was practicality. She thought of the Taoist parable of the empty boat. If a man crosses a river and an empty boat collides with his own skiff, he does not get angry. But if he sees a man in the boat, he shouts. That night, back in her hotel room, Mara tried to do what she had been told to do in other kinds of winters. Sit still. Watch the mind. Let the mind settle like snow. Someone had once handed her a thin meditation book with soft promises on the cover, as if a nervous system could be managed like a project plan. She closed the curtains. She turned off the lamp. She sat on the edge of the bed with her spine straight, hands resting on her knees, face neutral as if neutrality were a technology. At first, it almost worked. Breath in, breath out. The carpet's chemical smell, the radiator's faint ticking, the vending machine down the hall humming like a small, persistent machine room, the world narrowing into sensations she could name. Then her mind did what minds do when you try to command them. It rebelled.